2026 is the next big regulation change for Formula One. It's going to be a complete shift from what we currently have. In-wash concepts on the aero, which is currently speculated with the 2026 Audi Formula One model we have, the concept car. But the big and even more important part is the 2026 engine regulations. Why is this important? Well, throughout history, Formula One engines have always played a part in the winning teams. If you look back at McLaren, you look at the 2014 Mercedes, it's been a continuous trend. Usually the teams with the strongest engines end up coming out victorious. And we have a big shift going into so much more electrical power, so some teams might be stronger than others. We have heard our first 2026 engine thanks to this video.
Allowed to hear it, you're not allowed to see it.
Just running by, ooh, what did that noise change mean?
So it really just revved up the speed basically, and it's now going into this automated power curve. You can hear it's coming down in speed.
And we also know they're supposed to be louder and sound much more like a Formula car. This current turbo hybrid era has definitely not given us the most pleasant of sounds when you hear sounds like the V8, V10, V12. All those were ridiculous sounds in the Formula cars. But now it's quite sad if you compare them to the previous roaring engines we used to have. It's going to be a big change for these engines. It's going to be more electrical power, going from 120 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. Less fuel, more horsepower. These cars are going to be now over 1,000 horsepower, and less fuel is going to be put into the car on race day. There will be also a engine-specific cost cap, but which team is ahead? Which team is talking up the most and happy with how everything is going? I have every single team that is bringing engines, so the 6 that we have, which will be the Ferrari, Red Bull powertrains, Mercedes, Alpine with Renault, Audi, and Aston Martin Honda. Which of these has talked up the biggest game, and what do we know so far? The Alpine engine has been down since the regulation freeze in 2022. We're convinced that the horsepower in this car is not as strong as the Ferrari, Mercedes, or not even close to the Red Bull team. They've already spoken on the 2026 F1 chassis regulations and engine regulations that the actual chassis rules and how these cars are set up will hopefully negate the engine's power. Now, this is an interesting thing to say when it's also going to be different engines. And while Renault has a history of making insanely good engines from the Williams days back to also Red Bull, in recent years, and especially since we've had this electrical output put into these engines, Alpine has definitely been down, and I'm not very convinced that this team is going to be ahead or even close to the top, considering how they're speaking, but I really hope I'm wrong because they need a big shift or they're going to be selling out. The Audi team taking over Sauber in 2026 is quite the exciting prospect. They're making their own engines and they're now putting 100% effort into this Formula One entry. I gotta respect it, but going into a new engine regulation, while Audi does have the chance to do something insane, they probably have the least probable chance out of the remaining engine manufacturers. All the rest of them have worked in Formula One. Now, obviously Ford worked a long time ago, but they're working with Red Bull, so that gives them already a little bit more confidence. But Audi is going to need some time to actually take in how Formula One is, how they're going to make their way up in Formula One. Currently, the Sauber team is super far behind, and while that doesn't tell us how Audi is going to be, it does give us an idea that they're still far behind on aero concept, especially if they keep James Key, and we will know what the actual aero and chassis is supposed to be in June, so let's see who they keep and what they go for. I do think Audi is still kind of in that 5th realm. I think they'll be ahead of Alpine, but not convincingly. The Red Bull and Ford combination is probably the biggest leap in 2026. Considering they had the strongest car in 2021 at the beginning of the season, and also 22, 23, 24, we're probably going to see the strongest car in 25 be the Red Bull. Their engine has played a big part, as well as obviously the aerodynamics with Adrian Newey. From what Red Bull is saying, they're hitting their targets. We do hear a more unconfident Christian Horner in comparison to something like Toto Wolff. But he even mentions that we don't have the chassis rules yet, but if I was going back on any team to get the chassis right, I think we've got a reasonable track record. Considering he's mentioning that, I wonder where the progress is with this engine. Kind of the same thing with Audi. It's going to take some time to develop that perfect relationship to get that 2026 engine just right. And I do think the 3 other teams or engine manufacturers are going to have the front running on Red Bull. But I'd never count them out when it comes to aero. Even in the turbo hybrid era, pretty much from like 2016 onwards, the actual Red Bull car was the best aerodynamically built car, but the Mercedes engine was tuned like crazy and insane, so it tells you how much the engine plays a factor. That is why Red Bull is adamant on being on it now, and progress is happening quickly as we speak. It's hard to count the Ferrari team out ever when there's engine regulations. They've shown in previous years that they've built an insane engine, and in 2022, continuing onwards in this engine regulation, they do have the most horsepower coming out of the engine. They don't have the best ERS or electrical deployment, but the actual engine itself puts out a lot of power. In 2026, with the 50-50 split, it's going to be a big question mark for Ferrari whether they can nail it or not, but I would never count them out. They said they've been working on this 2026 engine pretty much since the beginning of 2022 and have been completely on it since these engine regulations have been confirmed. They've always had a strong engine, and I truly believe Ferrari is a very strong contender here in 2026 to have the best output in their engine. Considering also Lewis took the jump from Mercedes, who's pretty confident, to go to Ferrari, maybe he's heard a few things and maybe Ferrari is ahead of the curve. Still not much spoken by that team. Out of the 6 engine manufacturers we have, Aston Martin and Honda have spoken a good amount about the engine even recently. The recent discussion has been about them moving to Europe, having a Europe factory to work in unison with Aston Martin. This is going to be the same team that worked on the HRC package over there in Red Bull from the 2020 period to all the way till 2025. HRC being Honda Racing Corporation, where the boss is Koji Watanabe. He insists that he's still working on the durability and the reliability for the Red Bull car, but is adamant that Honda in 2026 is going to be a very good engine and they're working to be a championship winning team. At first it was uncertain if this is going to be the exact same squad that made the Red Bull engines, but yes, it will be. And while Alonso does have history with the team, we got to remember that McLaren team made the car a certain way to where Honda had to make the engine based off of the car. Typically, you make it the other way around. You make the car based off of the engine. That's usually the best way to work, so they already have prior experience, especially Alonso, to not make the same mistake again. He talks about in these new regulations, the keys to victory is a small, lightweight, high output motor. And obviously with that being the high performance in the batteries. Now, if we look at the Red Bull car now, it's slightly down on the Ferrari in horsepower, but when it comes to ERS and the electrical side of the engine, Honda reigns supreme. We can even use the Chinese GP as an example. While on the straight, Max Verstappen's ERS was not working for the first 2 laps of the race. He was falling back behind, wasn't able to keep up with Alonso and Hamilton at the time. And as they set the engine in a different mode, put the ERS back on, he catches them within a lap or 2. This has been consistent throughout the whole entire regulation period, and ever since Honda has been with Red Bull, they've been insane on their ERS, which makes them so fast in a straight line, obviously with also the aerodynamics, but this is going to be huge considering we're getting a 50-50 split going into 2026. This for Aston Martin's a big deal, and that's why I have them very highly ranked up here, very close to that of the Mercedes squad, and genuinely, they seem very passionate and confident about it. Considering Lawrence has been on board with this and everything he's been doing are steps upon steps, I expect a big improvement. And I do think this 2026 Honda engine is going to be quite impressive. The final team to speak about with the 2026 engine regulations is Mercedes. They've definitely been the biggest boasters of these regulations. They've been on board with these, even with Red Bull calling it a Frankenstein type of car with these engines. And considering the recent news that we've heard, that I wouldn't take too seriously about the F1 cars being slower than current F2 cars because of the engines, Mercedes has still backed these engine regulations and said nothing bad about them. It's weird that Lewis left the team in 25 and 26 when we know that these engine regulations have been something that Mercedes has been keeping an eye on. They've been adamant to keep these changes and are very confident in the new car being built for 2026 with the engine around it. They've only spoken confidently, and if you look at their 2014 car and what they were able to do there, where they had to tone down the engine to not make it look as big of a gap as it was, and it's probably the team that might have the best engine going into 2026, but considering these aero parts are not going to change much, they better hope that engine is going to be really good, because these regulations have not been it for the Mercedes team. A lot is being spoken about, but obviously till we know these cars are on track, we won't know what the engine output will be, and we'll see plenty of engine upgrades. There is a cost cap centered around it, which I think is nice. and it should hopefully keep the grid a lot closer. But with every engine regulation change, we always see one team step it up. Which team will it be? Well, I ordered them in what I think is the possibility. Honda seems very confident. Ferrari's also a team you can never really put out, but Mercedes definitely seems like they got the jump on everybody, saying that they're quite ahead. Obviously, this is all speculation and news, but it is spoken from the team principals, and that's where I got it from. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. What are your thoughts on the 2026 engine regulations? And as I said, don't look too much into the whole entire F2 thing. Every regulation change, there's always something being complained about before we seriously get into the regulations and we see how they're supposed to work. We complained about the 2022 ones with the floor design and so on, but as we saw in 2022, the racing was as close as ever. Obviously that's fallen back, but that's to do with the floor being raised and dirty air and so on. Leave your thoughts down below. Please leave a like, subscribe, and me in the world, and peace.